Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us tonight as we celebrate guest John Taylor Gatto's new collection of articles, A Different Kind of Teacher, Solving the Crisis of American Schooling. Thomas More has called Gatto a Socrates of the educational world. He has been named New York City Teacher of the Year and New York State Teacher of the Year for outstanding service to our public schools for 30 years. John is also the author of Dumbing Us Down and Underground, The History of American Education. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Taylor Gatto.
Thank you. I want to tell you that I had no idea that C-SPAN was going to be here until yesterday. So I sat up for the last 2 nights trying to write a presentation unsuccessfully, I'm afraid. I guess you're all West Siders and not just tourists passing through town. Let me give you my background. I taught in the schools of the West Side, that's Community School District 3, for 29 years and 8 months. I say 30 years. And in my book, Dumbing Us Down, I say 26 years because the horror of actually counting how many years I had been in the business was too great then. But it was 29 years, 8 months. Are there any teachers here who work in District 3? Not in 3. Okay, 3 runs from 60th Street, I believe, and then there's a dog leg in Harlem up, I believe, at about 120th Street. And there are 10 to 15,000 kids, depending on the year, held in the 20-odd schools of District 3. So I had experience with every aspect of the West Side in that L, the 300,000 people who live there. I began in the flagship school, IS 44 of the district, where the sons and daughters of the broadcasting elites and professional elites attended, and I concluded in a school on 109th Street, which produced 8 of the 10 muggers of the Central Park Jogger some years ago. And the most amazing thing was that from the beginning to the end of that 30 years, even though I saw the widest range of children, and I am not liberal by persuasion, the evidence in my eyes was impossible to overcome, that the differences between the kids who were ranked according to mathematical instrumentalities as hopeless and those who were classified as gifted and talented honors was so small that I had much greater success just assuming that there were no differences at all among those kids than following the careful scientific numbers that were set down in the cumulative records. Now, I must confess to having very little success convincing anyone else what the secret of my apparent achievement was, that I talked to these kids exactly as I would talk to my own children or to anyone else in the world. I made no allowances whatsoever for their academic background or their race or their living conditions or the condition of their family. I just assumed that, like myself, they were people interested in not having their time wasted. And the great surprise, although it didn't surprise me, but the great surprise, according to pedagogical theory, is that it worked unbelievably well. I had some discipline problems, but so few that people would ask me what the secret was. And I would say, well, look, I said, I think why you're having problems is that you talk to each one of your classes a different way, and they know that. And you talk to your colleagues a different way. Then you talk to school administrators a different way. And you're producing the kind of shifty behavior that nobody can get a grounding in. I mean, no one can trust you. So instead, they give back what they think they're getting, disrespect. Once again, I don't intend to try to convince you that there are no differences and that all of scientific pedagogy, as I've now come to conclude after 10 years of doing nothing other than researching the origins of this business, is utter nonsense. That we've built an employment empire out of theories that can't be tested. I'll probably refer to this again in I have a talk prepared for you, because that's what I have to inflict on you for CNN book notes. But then I'll stay as long as you want to talk back and forth and question and answer. Let me tell you an odd thing that happened to me after I left school teaching. I sent a resignation to the Wall Street Journal. I have no idea why to the Wall Street Journal, but that's where I sent it. And it was called I Quit, I think. And on, because I was really getting along in years, and now I'm deeply into old age, but I was getting along in years, and I didn't know how on earth I was going to pay the rent. So that was the only hesitation I had. And I found, without advance warning, that the Journal published that on July 25th, 1991. And I got a call 2 days later from NASA Goddard Space Center asking me if I could come down and lecture to the engineering colloquium there. And I said, you must have the wrong person. All I've ever spoken to all my life are 13-year-olds. But a day or two after that, I got a call from the White House asking me if I could come down and speak to the vice president, and then from the Nashville Center of the Arts, and then from the controller's annual meeting of the 32 operating divisions of United Technologies Corporation, which made me howl with laughter, since everyone in attendance at that 8-hour meeting we had together probably made more in a week than I had made in my entire lifetime. Nevertheless, I assumed that this period of odd encounter with the larger world would terminate. And so I wasn't particularly spooked by it. I thought, when this is over in a few weeks, I'll go up. I have a farm in upstate New York, not too far from Ithaca, 128 acres, which oddly enough, though we don't have time, I bought as a school project. I was trying to show kids that no matter how little money they had, that America is such a giveaway culture that everything is given away here, including big chunks of land, for nothing, as long as you don't need the fashionable signals. And I was challenged to buy such a piece of land and bought it as a classroom project. Anyway, you see I'm an Italian, and I wander all over the place. So that was in 1991 that these events took place. I assumed they would stop, and now we're in 2001, and I have traveled, according to my frequent flyer bank, 1.5 million air miles. I've probably driven another 100,000 miles. I've spoken in 50 states and 8 foreign countries. I'll be leaving for Singapore for about a month in 2 weeks for the third encounter with the Singapore government, who made me sign I better be quiet. Made me sign a contract, just like Apple Computer did, that if I told anybody that this encounter existed, that they would deny it and I would have to return the fee they were going to pay me. I'm sorry I'm doing this on television. That's an Italian for you. Anyway, so I've now appeared before about 800 audiences from every possible background, from the hog farm commune in central Tennessee to the John Birch Society to many, many homeschooling groups around the country. And the net upshot of that is that I can report to you as fellow West Siders that this country may be in trouble, but there's an awful lot of strength at the grassroots, an incredible amount of strength and understanding and an ability to very shortly pick up this school problem and have it solved outside of expert precincts. What I'm going to read to you from tonight, and I hope it won't sound like reading. I was asked after the Columbine thing to go out twice or 3 times, my memory really is getting, and speak to groups in Columbine about what I thought that event meant. And this talk is called Beyond Columbine and Its Politics of Scientific Management. For that, in effect, is what operates all the government schools in the country, and probably half the private schools, is a corpus of pedagogical theory and experience that operates outside your purview, outside the purview of local principals or superintendents, even of state education departments. Educational policy in the United States is made way, way out of sight of anyone that you can reach. And that is done deliberately in order that the managers won't be bothered by your hysteria and mine over what's happening to the kids. Okay, so this was what the people of Columbine heard, and my wife was right. I wish I had cleaned my glasses before I start. If you'll allow me to call the mass outpouring of anger and hostility which characterizes our institutions of public schooling the Columbine phenomenon, and I mean not just instances of carnage and arson, drugs and sexual assaults, but the whole gamut of generalized hostilities which pass before a teacher's eyes, then a great part of the responsibility for our Columbines can be attributed to the infrastructure of schooling itself. We took the wrong road in schooling about 100 years ago when we made its disciplines forced, and we put instruction into the hands of professionalized strangers. I'm sure many of you here are parents, and of course all of you have been students at one time or another. How many of you actually knew anything at all about the teachers who preempted your life? How could that possibly be? It has to be the most radical piece of social engineering, or one of them in the history of mankind, that you turn your child over to a succession of absolute strangers, and you might say, well, the state knows who they are, and I'm here to tell you they don't. I began as a school teacher. Now I think I'm past the statute of limitations on this. I was an advertising copywriter, and my roommate was a school teacher, and he taught one day, and went into the restaurant business. He said, you'd have to be crazy to do that for a living. So in between ad jobs, I took his license that he had pitched into the drawer, and I started to substitute around. Nobody ever bothered to check to find out who I was, who I said I was. I'll probably hear from the district attorney, and I'll tell him in advance I'm going to deny saying this. There's another fat guy wandering around who looks just like me. So we took the wrong road in schooling when we put instruction into the hands of professionalized strangers. We piled mistake upon mistake after that, overemphasizing the training that school could deliver, ringing bells in children's ears, extending childhood further and further into the most vigorous part of life, mathematically segregating kids according to the alchemy of standardized test scores, and finally committing the worst mistake of all, yoking the world of work to the world of schooling, forcing a connection which simply does not exist. And when we come to transcend our Columbines, it will be because we awaken from this self-induced nightmare and act out of two bedrock principles. One, that nobody can educate you except yourself. Surely our universal individual experiences confirm that one. And two, that over-organization precipitates entropy, the disintegration of order. It's a direct byproduct of over-organization. That's a principle of thermodynamics which, translated into everyday life, means simply that craziness increases in closed systems shut off from the outside. Washington, D.C. is, of course, a prominent example of this. For more years than any of us like to think about, inmates in schools have been shooting each other. Mind you, it is not a recent phenomenon. Since 1990, 267 people have been murdered inside our public schools. Now, for a long time, the press undertook a gentleman's and gentlewoman's agreement to be quiet about this. But of the 267 killed, you don't begin to understand the thousands who have been killed from encounters in school, the termination of which takes place outside of the building. Anyway, or committing arson or planting drugs on their teachers. That only happened to me twice. And avoiding the common standards of decent behavior in a number of other ways, all in order to express their hatred of these places. As a school teacher, I can tell you, it's almost axiomatic that when you meet a rotten kid on the street after school, he's usually as friendly and polite as anyone else, interested in what you're doing. In so-called good schools with no visible disruption, like PS 87 nearby, the disintegration of civility takes different forms, but it's there just the same. When American schooling stopped being primarily for mental development and character training, as the man or woman on the street would understand those things, it became a training ground to supply the existing economy with a particular kind of labor and customers that it needed. One buried byproduct of this shift was to sabotage free market principles, because by conditioning children to what is instead of what could be, it heavily subsidized existing commerce and social, political dispositions. It insulated them against future competition by indoctrinating children in what is and how to succeed with what is. Academic schooling of the past did not do that anywhere near the degree that modern school practice attempts. Another thing that happened to schools is they became large institutional analogs to factories is that the enterprise became a colossal works project, one in which passing out jobs became an end in itself, often jobs with the most tenuous connection to the needs of young people. School is training for work or is training to be a consumer, but never an independent producer or to sustain a mandated jobs pyramid. Schooling as any of these things requires tight control to prevent unwanted personal initiative. It requires top-down management. The difficulty here is that education, as contrasted with schooling, cries out for self-management. Indeed, it can be argued that the only practical reason to seek education is to achieve this end of becoming a self-manager. And I'm not trying to play word games here. The principle that nobody can educate you except yourself is as old as the hills. You can be trained from outside, but only educated from within. And this is a fatal contradiction, because one is a matter of habit and memory, and the other is a matter of learning how to seize the initiative. We have a society drowning in well-schooled people, yet clearly we are starving for educated ones. Mass institutional schooling is compelled to follow a corporate model. There's no choice. But since the product it seeks to produce, at least rhetorically, is an educated man or woman, it runs squarely into the dilemma that there is no known collective way to get there, but rather many individual ways. All of these, however, require a good deal of primary experience, which confinement schooling simply cannot offer. Instead, it must close students off from primary experience, substituting abstract exercises for it. It isn't a secret, nor does one have to be either liberal or conservative to see that this requirement damages education. The paradox is that the particular kinds of damage inflicted, loss of confidence, loss of independence, the development of certain habits and needs which have always characterized weak and dependent people, are actually useful to all complex management schemes. As the slightest amount of reflection should show you, would you as a manager wish to have a workforce of strong, independently minded, critically thinking people? Give me a break. Okay. Even to the most minor management functionaries, this paradox poses a constant temptation. In the setting of institutional schooling, minor functionaries are teachers, assistant principals, principals, and superintendents. Nobody who ever held one of these jobs hasn't been confronted with this paradox that the less the kids know, the easier they are to manage. Notice I didn't say they were easier to teach, but they are indubitably easier to manage. School training is and ought to be, for best results, something like light-duty military training. Religious schools and private schools in general know this. But military training in an all-volunteer army, nobody should need to be there. Education, on the other hand, is very unlike military training. Think of it as a complex example of what is sometimes called a helix sport. I'll explain what that is in a second, as it was explained to me a year ago and I fell in love with it. The big difference between so-called non-public education, where individuals with names and identities are fully in charge of their classes, and so-called public schools is that the public variety mimics corporate organization. Public personnel are functions in a system over which they have no effective control, none whatsoever. Just like corporate employees, they follow procedures sent down a rather long ladder of higher rungs from so far away the sender isn't even visible. Long experience with the futility of arguing with this kind of management makes most school teachers either compliant employees or sullen renegades. There's a sullen renegade up here. Only by disregarding the system's mandates can public school personnel do their charges much good in the way of education. But maverick teachers and principals have a way of not lasting very long in the school game. Public schools are always more doctrinaire and less intimate than religious schools, private schools, and of course home schools. This intimacy difference is decisive. The longer a kid hangs around government schools, the more certain it is that public teachers and administrators come to seem like puppets, unreal, ghost-like masks over a reality that no student really understands. This premonition that something eerie is hiding behind the school routines is a correct one, I think. As I said a moment ago, education at its best is a helix sport. Helix sports include wacky exercises like circumnavigating the country on foot, or more familiar challenges like gliding or rowing across the Atlantic, sailing alone out of sight of land, cross-country skiing over broken land in the wilderness, anything that pushes the individual to his or her limits without offering precise rules for every contingency. In a helix sport, unlike baseball or chess, the players are indifferent to competition or records. What they search for is a new relationship with themselves, a new relationship with the world. They are willing to endure discipline, even pain and risk to achieve these goals. And one person's helix sport, like one person's education, is not another's. In a helix sport, the participants do most of the work and take most of the risk. Coaching is only a small part of it. Think of sailing out of sight of land, which for thousands of years, elite families have seen to it that many of their children, usually sons, but lately both sexes, get to do. Out of sight of land, you're 12 years old, and you're in a sailboat. You don't know where you are. And if you don't know what you're doing, you're in big trouble, and you're in horrible trouble if a wind or swells come up. Helix sports are like sticking your 6-year-old kid on horseback, as was the rule and still is the rule for the British upper classes. If a kid at the age of 6 can master a semi-wild animal that weighs half a ton, then what would daunt that person later on? And you say, yes, but what if he's thrown and breaks his neck? Well, I don't ride. I can't tell you what happens in that. Okay, whatever pushes the individual to his or her limits. Now, learning to play tennis, not from having a racket in your hand, because you can't afford a racket, not from having lessons from a pro, because you can't afford a pro, but learning to play tennis from books and videos is a helix sport. That was exactly how the Williams sisters learned to play tennis. He was a mailman. He couldn't afford tennis camps. He and his wife checked the tennis videos out of the library. They read the little books, you know, with the little stick figures doing this thing. And then those were the kids' coaches. That's Venus and Serena. I would call them millionaires, but they're well into being multimillionaires. Each one with a multi-million-dollar home. God bless them. Doing that threatened to upset the entire security of the Williams lower middle class world. I mean, what did their friends say? You're doing what? And your daughters are playing tennis 6 hours a day, 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day as they got older? We only know that it happened at all because the Williams sisters became rich and famous while still teenagers. But it would have been profoundly educational even if they never made a penny from doing that. Helixing and education both put expertise in perspective because they use expertise only to travel where experts have never been, into regions of personal truth which radically alter the outcomes of your entire life, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. Bringing children up smart, strong, brave, independent, compassionate, and loving is certainly a helix sport on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Piaget or Dr. Spock cannot help you much at all. Doing it forces you to realize that no boy or girl on earth is just like any other. If you can't stand to make up a lot of your script as you go along, you are odds on to blow the assignment. Same thing in school teaching, by the way. But there you don't have much choice. There they don't let you improvise. That's why we call school people pedagogues, which was a term used in ancient Rome to describe a specialized class of slave. Do you think that usage happened by accident? Pedagogues didn't teach anything. They were to ensure that attendance happened and that whatever the master wanted memorized got memorized, not so that the kid could learn anything, because that was the dead giveaway that obedience had been indoctrinated into the kid. You throw things stupid or sensible out to memorize. The ones who memorize it are telling you we are obedient. And then there's this fall off down to the ones who don't memorize it that we call stupid. But really, what they are critically rejecting what they've been asked to memorize. If anything I'm saying sounds far out, remember that I paid my dues in 30 years or 29 years and 8 months in every secondary school in Community School District 3 as the district fought desperately to get rid of me. Especially after my wife got elected to the school board and terminated 59 no-show jobs up there on 96th Street and elsewhere. But the paradox kicks in again. Too much growth makes people hard to manage, and the centralized corporate nature of our economy demands well-schooled workers, including professional people, trained in habits of uncritical consumption, not well-educated ones. We don't like to think this way very often, so I'm going to offer you proof that you can provide for yourself. Imagine, for instance, I'll give you about 4 seconds to do this, what kind of adult a cigarette company or a soda pop company actually needs for the corporate enterprise to thrive. That's cigarettes and soda pop. Why would these companies, which are heavily involved in what's called educational reform, why would these companies wish to produce the type of clientele who would reject cigarettes and soda pop. I think you have to believe in the Easter Bunny to believe that they would, or that they dispassionately say, here is some money. Isn't it just good business to seek to create the customer you need? Think about Microsoft, which some high-tech analysts believe has set back computer progress a full decade with its grotesquely error-prone Windows system in conjunction with its vastly superior marketing cloud. What kind of customer should Microsoft prefer? A knowledgeable, sophisticated one, or just the opposite? I mean, get real. I'm not trying to finger Microsoft as the great villain in our school drama, just trying to get you to acknowledge that the nature of big business is to sell whatever you've got to sell as hard as you can in any legal way that you can. That imperative produces our prosperity. But by just such a mental excursion, you ought to see that business has no business monkeying with education, because what education aims for is critical thinking as one of its central goals. Independence from consumption addiction for another, high moral standards for a third, and so on. And business is an activity aimed at producing profit. Nothing wrong with that in its own sphere. But it means that any sensible business is not likely to want people with strong sales resistance. If you don't believe that, sit in on a marketing seminar at Harvard. But the goal of any sensible education, one of them at least, is to strengthen resistance, to warn the buyer to beware. What exactly, or where exactly, do you see any crossover possibilities between these goals? The finest private school in America, and I mean, in my opinion, bar none, Groton Academy in Massachusetts, has only 340 students, although it could easily attract the children of 10,000 wealthy parents. If profit were its driving motive, if it were looked at solely as a business, what Groton is doing is insane. Why doesn't Groton become a high-class warehouse for rich kids and enrich itself in the process? Why doesn't it franchise out the Groton name and earn hundreds of millions of dollars? 340 kids a year, about 10% of whom are on scholarship. Well, the answer to that has to be, although I've never spoken to anyone at Groton, the answer to that has to be that the central purpose of the school is education and not business or schooling. For one thing, schools have to create an in-house culture of immaturity and hypocritical competition. That is competition to no proper end. You know and I know that the people who score well on standardized tests and the people who score fairly well and the people who score in a mediocre way and even the people who score poorly have no differences among them. They have no differences among them even in the areas tested. We've known that for about 50 years. The only thing a standardized test score correlates with is the next standardized test. That it does brilliantly. If you score well on one, it'll say you're going to score well on the next, and you will. You will. This helps build the road to Columbine, even when the students come from prosperous families, as most do at Columbine. Another drawback of warehouse schooling, as opposed to Groton-type schooling, warehouse schooling is the standard American model since James Bryant Conant, longtime Harvard president, evangelized the form back in the 1950s, is that warehouses deprive children of significant encounters with older people. After a rather short exposure to these incubators, a lot of kids don't even want encounters with older people. Just ask them. I did for 30 years. The culture of immaturity claims them for a long time or almost forever. The visible imperatives of our Columbines, like tracking and standardized testing, are such a bald-faced endeavor to create a class society like Britain's. It's no wonder that kids catch on and get mad. School robs them of hope. School is like a sick joke. Doing well in these places does you in as often as it does you good. In the nature of that paradox, school personnel are given no choice but to become liars and to believe their own lies. In the economy that we've fashioned, 40% of the population, these are very recent figures, have absolutely no hope at all. They live from paycheck to paycheck. An additional 50% of the population compete in a dog-eat-dog fashion for 30% of the national wealth. And the remaining wealth is in 10% of the hands, but if you look at the 10%, the top 1% have as much as the next 9. This game has been rigged. Schools must reflect the rigging of the economy. They have no choice. And teachers who say, if you do well here and here and here, the world has a place for you, are bald-faced liars. That isn't true for at least half of the children, no matter what they do. Sorry,
Okay, it's okay. You're the man.
Well, I mean, I just saw my class out there. So, if high SAT scores are the fairest passage to the rewards of our land, I want you to explain to me how George Bush became president with a mediocre 5.50 on the verbal part, which is much, much more important than the other part. And graduated from Yale, became a governor, a corporate executive, and now the president. And if you think I'm here to knock George Bush, let me tell you that the grand Democratic intellectual Bill Bradley, whom I'm sure some of you would have liked to vote for but didn't get a chance, became a senator with an embarrassingly low SAT score of 4.80 on the verbal. Bush graduated from Yale with a mediocre score, and Bradley graduated from Princeton with a horrible score. One became a governor, the other a senator, and one's now the president. I guess you think Al Gore's an exception. No, he flunked out of college his freshman year, flunking 6 of the 7 courses he took. Why doesn't the New York Times put that in banner headlines on the front cover? If you can be a senator, a governor, a vice president, and a president with this horrible academic record, why can't you be anything else? And in fact, let me step away from this a moment to tell you that the most prestigious scientific project in the world today, probably of this century, the Human Genome Project, is the product of one man, Craig Venter, on the private side, who was an absolute swine, cut school all the time, graduated with a horrible average, just barely graduated, and didn't go to college. He went into the Army and was shipped to Vietnam, not as an officer and a gentleman, but as a private soldier. That's the private side of the Human Genome Project. The public side, Dr. Francis Collins, didn't go to school at all. He was homeschooled on a sheep farm in Western Virginia, following no curriculum at all, and certainly, as he's testified, certainly not following a scientific or mathematical studies. He and his mother did what they wanted to do as long as they were interested in it, and as soon as they became bored with it, they did something else. He said in the New York Times about 4 years ago, I guess no one read this, that if the authorities had known what was going on, you know, he probably would have been in foster care and his mother in the clink. That's the Human Genome Project. Now, you couple that with the president, the vice president, the senator, the governor, and tell me that if you were able to look under the rug, that this refutation of the value of standardized tests isn't writ large in certain precincts of this society. So why should it control your son or daughter's destiny or your own? School robs children of hope on bogus grounds. Think of hope as the boundary phenomenon separating free men and women from drones, the hopeful from the hopeless. My insurance lady and I got to talking about schools once, and she revealed to me that her son, a senior in a fancy public school in a suburb much like Columbine, told her that he didn't want to go back his senior year. "I don't want to go," he said. "They make me feel like an idiot, an idiot." That's how the shooters at Columbine were made, because they were made to feel like idiots too. Those boys had everything the rules said made for a good life. Wealthy parents, beautiful homes, every toy they wanted, respectable parents, plenty of pocket money, intelligence, health, agreeable appearance. What they didn't have was hope. School was a minefield in which they were humiliated daily, and they said that often. They said that for several years before they went to the guns. In that dramatic arena of relationships we call school, the least important thing is the zone of ideas and morality. Warehouse schools like Columbine, now they would be appalled to hear me call them warehouse schools, because they have every amenity that money can buy. Warehouse schools like Columbine or PS 87 are lively theaters of psychodrama. I'm only picking on PS 87 because it's considered the elite of the elite on the elite West Side. And I happen to know PS 87 inside out. I worked across the street from it for 20 years. Warehouse schools like Columbine are lively theaters of psychodrama, and the dirty secret of these places is that their adult managers cannot succeed unless they stay on the good side of the right student leaders. Sometimes that's because the kid has a lot of prestige among contemporaries. Sometimes that's because the kid has clout through his or her parents. A typical guidance counselor responds to student complaints of harassment by asking, "What are you doing to make them dislike you?" Like you. Now imagine saying that to a Jew at Dachau, and you'll know how the victims feel in the West Side public schools and all over this nation. What are you doing to make them dislike you? The principal at Columbine appeared on CNN after the massacre and said that a snitch program would have prevented the bloodshed. A snitch program promises to give the growing up time of rich kids some of the flavor of life in a penal colony. I've never heard of a private school worth its salt that wouldn't turn on the snitcher if he or she pressed their tails too vigorously. At the very least, snitchers are shunned everywhere in polite society. Snitching at Columbine joins the already familiar package there of tracking kids as bright or dumb, standardization rituals, constant browbeating and bribes. It should settle once and for all the question of what separates public school from private. It's a matter of trust, an outlook on human nature, a different take on the purpose of going to school. Hope is the boundary phenomenon. If the best a boy or girl can hope for is to fit in to a fairly rigid pyramid of predetermined opportunity created by officials and social engineers, then the promise of America that we wouldn't be like the traps of England, Germany, France, or Asian countries is just silliness. If we are just parts of an enormous social machine, if system is dominant and not individuality, we should expect more Columbines as a penalty for revoking the American charter so profoundly. All the money in the world couldn't buy Klebold and Harris an education. At 17, they reached the end of the line. That's why they killed themselves. Other teenagers kill themselves to get out of the trap too. What the newspapers didn't bother to tell you is that Littleton, Colorado, an executive suburb, has been a national leader in teenage suicide for at least 30 years. And the American nation wears the same crown in world society. And poor kids don't commit suicide. That's a disease of comfortable families. Klebold and Harris committed suicide besides murdering some others. What you want to keep in mind when you think about teenage suicide is that it isn't at all a disease of ghettos, but pretty much a habit of prosperous kids who seem to catch on to school laws faster than the poor ones do. Public consideration of a snitch program at Columbine tells you all you need to know about the desperate status of public schooling in America. I can't even conceive of a good private school doing such a thing. The degraded view of human nature it suggests is terrifying. I cannot imagine a single homeschool in America teaching its children that brothers and sisters should snitch on one another. It's the moral numbness behind the pragmatism that shocks me. The menace of a police state where every neighbor spies on their fellows and authorities paw over the intimate details of one's life is much more horrifying to me than any school massacre I can think of. In my own life, I attended Jesuit boarding school briefly when I was 7, and there I saw another 7-year-old slapped in the face by the Jesuits for squealing that one of his classmates had 2 candy bars in violation of the rules. I know there are exceptions to this principle, but we're much better relying on good individual judgment and moral fiber to know when these exceptions occur than systematic snitch programs. Leave those to the police and their customary informants who can be paid to implicate anyone. It marks the difference between having faith in human nature and faith in rules and laws instead. The first allows us dignity. It involves everyone as a central player in the maintenance of order. Think of it as a helix sport, the kind that once allowed villages all over the country to go without any policeman at all. I grew up in such a place, and my farm in upstate New York is in such a town. No policeman at all. Those who believe hierarchical management can be imposed on education as well as schooling. Those who believe that education should be made a reciprocal of the existing economy, those are the school-to-work programs I'm referring to here, do not understand America and do not understand the principle of thermodynamics that teaches that over-organization destroys any real good that organization can achieve. In April of 1994, long before any shooting occurred, Columbine was the site of a revolution in school management, in which an 8-year-long experiment in which the faculty, the parents, and the students created the text of the school was overthrown by a new school board. In its place, a new outcomes-based, centralized management regime was substituted. Commenting on community outrage in 1994, the president of that new school board was quoted in Education Week as saying, quote, "I don't suppose we're going to begin killing each other just because." He really did say that. I didn't make that up. The New York Times failed to dig that out, but they're welcome to it for nothing. No official analysis since Columbine has been willing to think about whether that tragedy was inherent in the logic of remotely managed forced schooling itself, that it might be a system which grossly overextends itself into the lives of the young for the benefit of ensuring the economic and political status quo, to make management simpler and easier. Once all major possibilities for the future are contained in a quantitative code set down by the past, a closed system is created contrary to the laws of social thermodynamics. In all history, no closed social system has ever sustained itself forever. All of them are overthrown. They corrupt themselves by cutting off so many people from a voice at the table. All attempts at final closure, at ending history, have disintegrated into violence, as happened in Rome with Commodus and in the Soviet Union just yesterday. In thermodynamics, entropy is the customary term used to describe disorganization. Harris and Klebold disorganized 15 living souls thoroughly and many more severely. They partially disorganized a confident institution and a proud community. But from the look of its surveillance cameras and snitch programs, Columbine doesn't seem to have learned anything. Someone there thinks that an even tighter organization than before will solve the problem. So did the Soviets. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, public schools were deliberately organized as closed systems because that made management more efficient. The real question we're not used to asking is, at what point does efficient management rob us of the things that make life worthwhile? You know that point is close at hand when rich kids kill themselves, and when most kids would rather sit in front of screens watching virtual reality or punching buttons than going out to play the helix sport of a good life. It's a fantastic irony, a genuine paradox, that the Soviet Union came down in ruins because of its surveillance cameras, its snitches, its police, its identity cards, its metal detectors, its well-schooled, test-savvy elites that could run rings around the graduates of the best schools in the United States. It fell because it had those things, not in spite of them. Every year our own public school system becomes larger and tighter. Every year it demands more and more of the national wealth to weave its web more densely. For the past decade and more, forced schooling has been making aggressive attempts to nationalize itself. In this aim, it has had the aid of big business. Nationalized schooling is the ultimate socialization. It seeks national goals, national teaching licenses, national standardized exams, and a national system of employment rewards for those who play ball in school. In spite of a mountain of evidence, that's what really keeps America the only place people want to migrate to on earth. They perceive that this is the only place that still allows its citizens to argue, to think for themselves. Schools try their best to foreclose that possibility. Just 5 more minutes. Learning to think and having the courage to think becomes harder and harder thanks to school. The strongest meshes of the net are invisible until a wealthy, well-favored boy like Dylan Klebold in his $3 million home rubs our faces in the reality. School creates a chemistry which produces most of the common characteristics of modern school children: indifference, dishonesty, boredom, malice, treachery, cruelty, whining, self-pity, boasting, greed, a short attention span. I once saw the student president of Columbine on national TV leading a pep rally before that school reopened. He boasted, "We are taking back Columbine." Not a word about the slaughtered and maimed, not a word about grief or remorse, no thoughtful analysis of cause or prescription for prevention. Where was the humility that moment called for? Instead, we got a mindless display by the leader of students at Columbine. And what's most important, surely his speech had been pre-screened by the school administration, who found it just fine. Asked if he felt strange about entering the place of execution only 120 days after the killings, he said bluntly that he felt nothing out of the ordinary at all. He was glad to be back in a place he thought of as home, perhaps even more homey than his real home where he lived with his parents. He said that. He did. My skin crawled. Who wins or loses in the warehouse schools of America has little to do with merit and much to do with the luck of birth and shrewd calculations about how the game of status is really played. The wealth of America is now divided, as I told you in an ad lib earlier, in the following fashion, according to recent reports. 5% of the population owns 59% of the wealth. If that fraction is enlarged to 10%, that 10% owns 70% of the wealth. The bottom 40% of the citizenry owns nothing at all. Actually, it possesses 0.2% of the wealth, or virtually nothing. The remaining 30% is fought over by 50% of our people. One half of us, that 50%, who call themselves middle class, live in a dog-eat-dog world where a slip or misjudgment is fatal. And 40% more are so far down, they live from day to day with little hope. Something isn't right. This isn't the America I was born into. There are some advantages in being old. Dumbed-down, forced schooling of the government variety built this new world. Whether accidentally or deliberately, you can draw your own conclusions. Mine are contained in those books over there. The most destructive dynamic in schools like Columbine is the very same thing that causes caged rats to develop eccentric and even violent mannerisms when they press a bar for food, when the delivery mechanism has deliberately been programmed to release food on a random schedule. But the rat knows nothing about that, or that nothing it does can change when the food is coming. The rat cannot know that its activity is irrelevant any more than the millions of children in these school traps know that what they do is irrelevant. The rat can't know, although it surely suspects something must be wrong. It doesn't know what to do beside mindlessly pressing the bar faster or indulging in weird gyrations to placate the food gods. Much weird behavior the kids display in school is a function of the insane and dishonest reinforcement schedule which rewards children for acting against their own best interests, for betraying their parents, their cultures, their religions, their local traditions, and themselves. This, along with endless confinement and endless inactivity in ugly and stupefying environments, slowly drives children out of their minds. Trapped children, like trapped rats, need close professional management. If it's self-management you seek for your own boys and girls, you'll have to leave public school to find it. I wish that weren't true, but it is. Thank you. Now we can talk. So I'd be happy to field any queries, and there's a mic here so that you'll be heard on C-SPAN too. Funny, a friend of mine who's a former student, the guy who was the director of the New Eureka Poets Cafe downtown, said to me before I didn't know we were going to be on C-SPAN, and he said, "You can't ever hear the questions." I said, "Well, what will I do if they ask me questions that I can't answer?" He said, "Don't worry." He says, "You can't ever hear the questions on these shows." So he said, "You can answer any question." But now, through the magic of electronics, yes, ma'am, there's a question up here in front.
I want to know, since you spent 30 years, in the public school, knowing what you say you know,
yeah.
You couldn't have spent 30 years of your life not trying to do something significant.
Right. Well.
And so
right.
for many of us who are trying to do something significant, and for the parents who don't know and don't know how to go about having options, what are some significant things that can be done if one is in a situation where you have to deliver education to children in that environment?
You know, I'm delighted you asked that question, because when I walked into this bookstore this evening, the guy who was there to greet me said to me, I went to Booker T. It was one of the schools I taught in. I went to Booker T. and I knew what was going on. He said, so with my own son, he said, I did things differently at home, even though the kid went to school, he said. And I believe, is that fellow here who I spoke to? Hello. Would you, could he have the mic and just tell him where your son is?
Yes, what I did was I applied the principles that he was talking about, and I would always ask my son, I said, what did you learn at school today? And I would see that everything he was telling me was really irrelevant to real life, so I would do some real schooling at home. And he graduated high school at 17.
He graduated high school at 17. There's the father. Now, oddly enough, one of the benefits, there's a lot of detractions, but one of the benefits of constantly traveling around the country and talking to people who've homeschooled their kids, sometimes not by actually taking them out of school, is that the success record is phenomenal, and it does not depend on prior education or even income of the family. I was just blown away by about the second year. You can, in fact, counteract these poisons as long as you can, in fact, counteract them in school, but it's much harder to do because you have to be, I'm not being melodramatic, a saboteur. You have to break laws. I won the New York State Teacher of the Year Award, and several times the New York City Teacher of the Award, by breaking the law. I engaged in criminal behavior. I did not tell the screening committees that. They just looked at the results and thought I had some magic secret. And I had the magic secret that millions of people who know that you provide your own education and someone else can only train you, and then only to a limited degree. So my kids wrote an incredible record because I have to be very careful because I'm not sure about this statute of limitations. It's been 10 years. Is there a lawyer in the house here? I someday intend to write about the freeing mechanisms I use, but I can tell you one way, if you're a teacher yourself, if you form a bond with the parents, again, regardless of their economic background or anything else, you form a bond with the parents and they believe you want the best for your kids there, and they get to co-teach with you, you have a blank check. There isn't a school in the world that wants to tangle with a group of parents who are irate there. So if you clear things with parents first, very often local principals will simply look the other way. Now, if you rub their face in it, I guess they're compelled to feed you into the grinder. But my kids operated as if the textbook with all 5 boroughs of New York City and Jersey in about 10 miles. And in some